She was 8 years old. 8. And for 18 days. No one reported her missing. Not her school. Not the system responsible for tracking her. Not the people who were supposed to notice. 18 days. That's how long an 8-year-old girl disappeared before anyone officially came looking. And by the time they did, the timeline was already broken. Because this case isn't just about what happened to Relisha Rudd. It's about how many chances there were to stop it, and how every single one of them was missed. And this is the open file. Relisha Rudd was 8 years old in March of 2014. She was living with her family inside the DC General Family Shelter in Washington, D.C. That detail matters more than it might seem at first, because it means her life existed inside a system designed to provide oversight, to track, to monitor, to intervene when something went wrong. She was enrolled in school. She had a daily structure. People who were supposed to see her regularly. People who were supposed to recognize if she wasn't there. But at some point, that structure started to break. Relisha stopped showing up to school. One day became several. Several became weeks. By the time anyone began asking serious questions, she had missed more than 30 days of school. 30 days. That's not an absence. That's a disappearance in slow motion. And yet, for most of that time, there was no urgent escalation, no immediate intervention, no system-wide response that reflected the reality of what was happening. Instead, there were explanations. At some point, officials were told that Relisha was being cared for by a man, someone who had access to her environment, someone connected to the shelter, someone who, at least initially, was trusted. His name was Khalil Tatum. He was 51 years old, and he worked as a janitor at the shelter where Relisha and her family were staying. That connection alone should have raised concern. An unrelated adult male responsible for the care of a child. That's a situation that demands verification, oversight, clear documentation. But that didn't happen. Instead, the explanation was accepted, at least for a period of time. And during that time, Relisha remained unseen. This is where the case becomes difficult to process, because this wasn't a sudden disappearance. It wasn't a single moment of chaos. It was gradual, a child missing school, an explanation that wasn't fully checked, a situation that was allowed to continue longer than it should have. Each of those moments was a point where the outcome could have changed, but none of them did. Eventually, someone looked closer. A school social worker began asking questions. Why had this child been absent for so long? Who had confirmed her whereabouts? Why was there no verifiable record of her being seen? And once those questions started, the situation began to unravel, because there was no clear answer, no consistent timeline, no confirmed location, no evidence that matched the explanation that had been accepted. And suddenly, the reality became unavoidable. Relisha Rudd wasn't just absent, she was missing. She was officially reported missing on March 19th, 2014. But by that point, the most critical part of the timeline had already passed. The last confirmed sighting of Relisha came from surveillance footage. March 1st, 2014. She was seen with Khalil Tatum at a Holiday Inn Express in Northeast Washington, D.C. That footage is the last verified moment she was alive, and everything after that is unknown. No confirmed sightings, no verified contact, no clear movement, just a gap, an 18-day gap between the last moment of certainty and the moment authorities were finally alerted. That gap is the center of this case, because inside those 18 days, something happened, something that has never been fully explained. Once law enforcement understood the situation, the urgency changed immediately. This was no longer a question of attendance. This was a missing child investigation, and the focus turned directly to Khalil Tatum, the last person seen with Relisha, the man who had been trusted, the man whose explanation had been accepted. But as investigators began searching for him, the case took another turn, a darker one. Tatum's wife was found dead. She had been discovered inside a hotel room in Prince George's County, Maryland. She had been shot. That discovery changed the entire trajectory of the case, because now, this wasn't just a disappearance. It was connected to a homicide, and the person at the center of both was missing. Law enforcement intensified their search for Tatum, for Relisha, for anything that could explain what had happened. But the search didn't lead to answers. It led to another ending. On April 1st, 2014, Khalil Tatum was found dead. Authorities ruled it an apparent suicide. And just like that, the one person believed to have direct knowledge of what happened to Relisha was gone, taking with him whatever he knew. And that changes a case in a way that's hard to recover from, because without that central account, everything becomes reconstruction. Investigators are left with fragments, timelines, movements, evidence that can be interpreted, but never confirmed through direct explanation. Search efforts continued. Authorities examined areas connected to Tatum, wooded locations, properties, spaces where any trace of evidence might exist, but nothing definitive was found. No confirmed remains, no physical evidence that could close the case, only absence. And absence is one of the hardest things to investigate, because absence doesn't tell you what happened. It only tells you that something did. And that's where time becomes the most important factor. Because those 18 days didn't just delay the investigation, they reshaped it. Every hour that passed without awareness was an hour where evidence could disappear, where timelines could blur, where opportunities to intervene were lost. That's what makes this case more than a disappearance. Because Relisha didn't vanish in isolation. She disappeared within a system that was supposed to protect her, a system that was supposed to notice. And in this case, it didn't. Her absence from school wasn't escalated soon enough. The explanation for her whereabouts wasn't verified. The situation wasn't investigated with urgency, and by the time it was, the most important part of the timeline had already passed. That's not just a failure of awareness. That's a failure of structure. Because the safeguards that were supposed to prevent exactly this situation didn't activate. And that raises a deeper question. Not just what happened to Relisha, but how many chances there were to stop it. Because this wasn't sudden. It developed, a missed day, then another, then another. A growing absence that should have triggered concern much earlier than it did. Each of those days was an opportunity to verify, to intervene, to act, and each one passed. That's what makes this case so difficult, because the disappearance didn't begin when it was reported. It began much earlier, in the moments that were overlooked, the questions that weren't asked, the explanations that weren't challenged. That's where the timeline first broke, and by the time anyone recognized it, it was already too late to recover what had been lost. Even now, years later, the case remains open. Relisha Rudd has never been found. The FBI continues to offer a reward for information, and the central question remains unchanged. What happened after March 1st, 2014? Because that's where certainty ends, and everything else begins. Relisha Rudd was 8 years old. 8 years old, and missing for weeks before anyone raised the alarm. That fact alone should never feel normal. And yet, it happened. Not because no one cared, but because systems failed to act when they should have. Because explanations weren't verified. Because timelines weren't enforced. Because urgency didn't arrive soon enough. And in that delay, something irreversible occurred. We may never know exactly what happened during those missing 18 days, but we know enough to understand this. The disappearance didn't start when it was reported. It started in the moments that were missed. The overlooked signs, the unchecked assumptions, the time that passed without action. That's where everything changed. And that's what makes this case more than a mystery. It makes it a warning, because the most dangerous disappearances aren't always the ones that happen instantly. They're the ones that happen slowly, right in front of people, without being recognized for what they are. Relisha Rudd didn't just disappear, she was missed. By a system, by a timeline, by the moments that could have changed everything. And until the truth of what happened is fully uncovered, this case remains open.